The ridge is on fire. Corporal Mitchell Hayes presses his face into the volcanic rock and counts the muzzle flashes, 1, 2, 4, 7, and stops counting because the number doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the trench line 20 meters ahead, the screaming that stopped 3 minutes ago from somewhere to his left where Rodriguez used to be, and the single fact that has become the only truth on this island. He is alone. Below him, somewhere in the smoke and coral dust, the rest of Baker Company has pulled back on orders he received 30 seconds too late. Above him, the Imperial Japanese Army's 62nd Infantry Battalion, 340 men who have held this ridge for 11 days against everything the United States Marine Corps has thrown at them, is preparing to finish what the ambush started. The ambush. That was the thing nobody had told him about. In 8 minutes, Corporal Mitchell Hayes of Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, will stand in the center of that trench line and look at what one American soldier left behind him. Military historians will spend decades arguing about the numbers. The Japanese will give him a name that roughly translates to the storm that had no beginning, a name born from something they saw him do in the first 90 seconds that none of their tactical training had ever prepared them for. But right now, in the late morning heat of September 1944, on the island of Peleliu, Mitchell Hayes has 2 rounds left in his MA1 Garand, a field dressing on his left thigh that's soaking through for the 3rd time, and a cigarette photograph of a woman named Clara folded so many times it has started to come apart along the crease. He presses it flat against his chest. He begins to move, and somewhere up in that ridge, the most battle-hardened rifle company in the Japanese Pacific Garrison starts to realize that what is coming toward them cannot be measured or prepared for, because the thing that is coming is not an army. It is just him. Mitchell Arlen Hayes was born in Gallatin, Tennessee, on March 4th, 1921, the second of 3 boys raised on a tobacco farm that flooded every spring and refused to produce enough to justify the labor every autumn. His father, Arden Hayes, a veteran of the Argonne Forest, who never spoke about France, but sometimes woke the whole house at 2 in the morning with sounds that had no name. He taught his sons one thing above all others. You finish what you start, or you don't start at all. Mitch, nobody called him Mitchell except his mother and his sergeants, graduated Gallatin High School in 1939 and spent 2 years working a machine lathe at a stamping plant in Nashville before enlisting in the Marine Corps the morning of December 9th, 1941. He was at the recruitment office before it opened. 3 other men from Sumner County were already waiting on the steps. He was not the biggest Marine in Baker Company. He was not the fastest. His rifle scores at Camp Lejeune were excellent, but not extraordinary. What his platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Frank DeLuca, noted in a letter home to his wife in March of 1943, or it was something harder to quantify. There's a kid named Hayes who just doesn't seem to understand when something is finished. You can tell him the exercise is over, and he'll still be doing it. Not stupid. He hears you. He just finishes. His fellow Marines called him the Tennessean, not for any particular reason, except that he said so few words that the ones he did say tended to come out with a drawl that made them sound like they'd been considered for several days before being released. He carried a photograph of Clara Bowen, his girl from Gallatin, in the breast pocket of his jacket, folded 4 times so it fit between the second and third button. He'd promised her he'd come back. He said it once. He didn't repeat himself about things like that. The photograph had been in that pocket through Guadalcanal, through Cape Gloucester, and through 3 landings and more firefights than the official record fully captures. By the time Baker Company boarded the LSTs for Peleliu, it had been folded and unfolded so many times that Clara's face was bisected by a white crease running straight through her eyes, as if the war was slowly erasing her. He never let it finish. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten Heroes, free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now back in the video. The original operational plan for D+11 on Peleliu, September 26, 1944, called for Baker Company, reinforced by elements of Charlie Company, to assault and capture Objective Hill 140, a coral ridgeline in the central Umur-Brogol pocket that Marine Corps intelligence had designated a secondary command position. The briefing made it sound almost manageable. Intelligence estimated the position held by approximately 60 to 80 Japanese defenders, a mix of infantry and support troops, with 2 light machine gun emplacements and a single heavy mortar position. The approach would be made along a coral draw that aerial photography suggested was relatively open, covered by a smoke screen from the battalion's 60mm mortars, with 2 rifle platoons attacking abreast and a third in reserve. Estimated time to objective, 45 minutes. Estimated resistance, moderate. What the intelligence did not account for was what the 62nd Infantry Battalion had spent the previous 11 nights doing. A Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, arguably the most capable defensive commander the Imperial Japanese Army deployed in the entire Pacific campaign, had fortified the Umur-Brogol pocket into a network of interlocking caves, bunkers, and fighting positions that the Marine Corps would later describe, in understated official language, as the most formidable defensive terrain encountered in the Pacific theater. His men had drilled until every field of fire, every fallback position, every covered withdrawal route was automatic. They had pre-registered their mortars on every approach. They had reinforced Objective Hill 140, not with the 60 to 80 men intelligence estimated, but with 280 men in hardened positions, a number that would not become clear until Baker Company's point element was already halfway up the draw. These were not conscripts, and these were veterans of Manchuria and China, men who had been fighting since 1937, men whose unit had never surrendered a position it had been ordered to hold. Their kill record against the previous Marine assaults on the Umur-Brogol ridgeline spoke for itself. In 11 days, they had inflicted casualties at a rate that was making battalion commanders recalculate their arithmetic about what it cost to take this island. The draw that aerial photography had called relatively open was, on the ground, a 40-meter corridor of exposed coral flanked on both sides by elevated positions with interlocking fields of fire. The moment Baker Company's 1st platoon moved into it at 08:47 hours, 2 things happened simultaneously. The smoke screen, degraded by an unexpected crosswind, dissipated early, and the Japanese, who had watched the approach with perfect patience, opened fire from 3 directions at once. It was not an engagement. It was an ambush on a scale that the intelligence estimate had made impossible to plan for. The first platoon took 11 casualties in under 2 minutes. The company commander, Captain Warren Ellison, went down with a through-and-through wound to the shoulder in the first 40 seconds. The reserve platoon, moving up to support, walked directly into a secondary firing position nobody had known existed. Then the radio crackled. Battalion had made a decision. The assault on Hill 140 was being suspended. The companies were to break contact, pull back to the battalion perimeter, and consolidate for a renewed effort with artillery preparation the following morning. The order was specific: disengage immediately, on no exceptions. It was the right order for a unit. It was the wrong order for a man who had already crossed the point of no return in the draw. Corporal Hayes had been moving forward with the second element when the order came through. He was 40 meters inside the coral corridor, behind a boulder the size of a refrigerator, with Sergeant Rodriguez 4 meters to his left and Private Camacho 8 meters to his right. By the time the order reached him, and he processed it, Rodriguez had taken a round through the neck. Camacho had pulled back. The draw behind him was empty and swept by fire. 40 meters in the wrong direction might as well have been a mile. He did the math, the only way a Marine does it, in a draw with the smoke gone and the radio screaming retreat. The route back was the killing ground. The route forward, through 280 entrenched Japanese soldiers, was at least a direction nobody would be shooting from. His M1 Garand held 8 rounds. He had 4 spare on-block clips on his belt, his field knife, 1 fragmentation grenade, a wound in his left thigh from a shrapnel fragment that had opened during the initial movement and was bleeding steadily into his boot. He had no water. His last canteen had taken around 20 minutes earlier. He pressed his back against the boulder and looked at what was ahead of him. 1 man, 1 uncaptured position, a mission the Marine Corps had officially suspended. He didn't retreat from things he'd already started. He moved low along the left wall of the draw, using the dead ground where the coral ridge met the slope, staying below the sight lines of the elevated positions on his right. 40 meters, then 30. The smoke had thinned to haze but not cleared, and he used what was left of it the way a man uses a shadow, not for cover, exactly, but for doubt. From the ridgeline, the Japanese positions were a model of disciplined military architecture. Sergeant Kenji Morita of the 3rd Company, 62nd Battalion, a 12-year veteran who had survived Nanking, the Solomons Campaign, and 2 Marine assaults on the Umur Brogol Pocket, commanded the forward fighting position with the same methodical confidence he brought to everything. He had 13 men under him in 3 separate gun pits, overlapping fields of fire, and a prearranged signal to the heavy mortar position 60 meters back. His squad had not broken a single position in 11 days, and the Marines who had come at him before had come in organized waves with fire support, and he had stopped every one of them. He watched the draw below him through his scope and saw exactly what he expected to see: an empty killing ground. Whatever American element had entered it was gone or dead. The assault was over. He began to relax his men into a modified alert posture. He was 3 seconds from the next cigarette of his life when the world changed. Hayes came over the left rim of the draw at a point nobody had designated as an approach route, because nobody had designated it, because it was a 20-meter climb up loose coral with no cover and under fire from two directions, which is exactly the reason nobody would ever try it. His thigh was on fire. His hands were bleeding from the rock. He crested the rim in a dead run and threw himself flat behind a fighting pit that was, for one improbable second, between two Japanese positions and aimed at neither of them. He had 4 seconds before Morita's men repositioned, and then the trap that nobody had told him about was already closing. The flanking position, a secondary pit dug specifically to cover this approach from the coral rim, hidden so completely by an overhang of rock that it did not appear in any intelligence photograph, opened fire from 8 meters away. 8 meters. At that range, the burst of Type 96 light machine gun fire should have been unsurvivable. 2 rounds cut the air where Hayes' center mass had been 1/5 of a second earlier. One clipped the top of his left shoulder, not through, but enough to knock him sideways, off balance, pitching him left and down, behind the corner of the Japanese fighting pit, in a fall that he did not control and did not choose, and that placed the pit itself between him and the gun that had just tried to kill him. He had not decided to fall there. He fell there. And in the 3 seconds it took the machine gun crew to adjust their angle, he pulled his last fragmentation grenade, held the spoon, released it, counted 1, and rolled it around the corner of the fighting pit. The detonation was close enough that he felt the concussion in his chest before he heard it. Then, he was up and moving before the dust had cleared, because the only thing that covers a man without cover is speed. And what he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense at all, till you understand what he had already seen on that ridge that no one else on the battlefield could see. He had seen the women. Before the flanking position opened up, in the 2 seconds he'd had on that coral rim before diving forward, Hayes had seen what the pre-assault intelligence had not found and what no aerial photograph could have detected. Civilians. 3 women and an older man crouched in the back corner of the largest fighting pit. Palawan civilians, likely seized by the garrison as laborers or positioned as human shields against exactly the kind of assault that was now one American soldier moving across the ridge. The oldest woman had white hair. She was holding something, a small bundle, pressed against her chest, the way a person holds something they cannot afford to lose. He'd had a fraction of a second to process it, and that fraction had changed everything. Micro Scene 1. The fighting pit from which the machine gun crew had been operating was now a crater and 2 motionless shapes. Hayes moved right along the trench line, staying low, rifle up. The first soldier who came around the bend in the trench had his weapon at low ready and his head turned left, looking for the American who had come from the impossible direction and then been swallowed by the dust. He didn't see what was in front of him until it was too late to matter. Hayes was down to 6 rounds in the Garand. Micro Scene 2. From the second gun pit, 30 meters along the ridge, 2 soldiers were calling out, not in the controlled, clipped cadence of a unit passing tactical information, but in the higher frequency, rising pitch of men trying to locate something they could not find and could not understand. Sergeant Morita's voice cut through them, hard and sharp, re-establishing discipline. He was calling for a count of the attackers. Nobody could give him a number. One man, 4 positions compromised. No one could explain the trajectory that had brought this destruction from the direction it had come from, because that direction was not a direction an attacker was supposed to be able to approach from. How many are out there? The call went down the trench line in Japanese. Urgent. Official. Silence from the positions that knew the answer. The ones that didn't know the answer were the ones still alive. Micro Scene 3. The problem of the civilians changed his approach completely. And the mortar position 60 meters back was pre-registered on this section of trench. If Morita called it in, the position could be cleared with fire support in 30 seconds. But the women and the old man were in a fighting pit directly in the mortar's impact zone. Hayes knew this with the same instinct that a Marine earns not from training, but from standing in a place and understanding it. He had to clear the position between himself and those civilians before Morita got a radio call through. He moved slower, crouching, more exposed than he should have been. His thigh opened up again on the second crawl. He tightened the field dressing with his teeth and kept moving. The cost was 20 seconds. 20 seconds he did not have. 20 seconds in which Morita's radio calls were becoming more coherent, more controlled, recovering discipline. 20 seconds that allowed Morita to redirect 2 men toward the fighting pit where the civilians were being held, either as reinforcement or as something worse. That was when Hayes made the decision that made no tactical sense. Instead of moving on Morita's position directly, straight down the trench line, using the speed that had kept him alive, he reversed direction. He moved backward along the ridge, away from the objective, toward the outer perimeter of the Japanese position. Every tactical principle said it was madness. He had his reasons. He just didn't have time to explain them. He found a pocket in the coral and stopped. Not by choice. His legs decided it before he did. The thigh wound had been bleeding for 3 hours. Not arterial. He would have been dead long ago if it had been. But steady, patient, and the kind of blood loss that doesn't announce itself until your vision starts to narrow at the edges and your hands start to shake at a frequency that you cannot compensate for. He pressed himself into the hollow and put both hands flat against the rock. They shook anyway. He was out of grenades. He had 4 rounds left in the Garand and no more clips. He had a 1911 on his hip with a full magazine. He had the knife. He had a water situation that had stopped being a situation and become a geological fact. There was no water. There hadn't been any for 5 hours. He was talking to Rodriguez. He became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware you've been asleep on a night watch. The words were already coming out of him before he registered he was saying them. Telling Rodriguez to keep pressure on it. Telling him the draw was clear, and they just needed to move. Using the present tense for a man whose blood was in a crack in the coral 20 meters downslope. He stopped. The silence on the ridge was the loudest thing he'd heard since the draw. Morita's men were no longer calling out to each other. That meant one of 2 things. They'd reorganized and were moving methodically to clear the position, or they'd called in the mortar. Either way, the window was closing. He thought about the order, the battalion order, the clean radio voice telling him to disengage. He thought about what it would have looked like to comply, pulling back through the draw that was being swept by fire, the route that had swallowed Rodriguez and 14 other Marines in the first 4 minutes. Complying with that order was theoretically correct and practically a death sentence. But there was a part of him, sitting in that coral pocket with 4 rounds and shaking hands, that thought maybe that was still the saner choice. Maybe this, one man on a Japanese ridge, with his dead comrades, and a mission that battalion had suspended, was the kind of thing a person who survived came home and quietly stopped telling stories about. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. The photograph of Clara was damp from his sweat and the blood that had worked up through the fabric. He unfolded it carefully, because the creases were getting worse, and each unfolding cost something that could not be replaced. Her face bisected by that white line. Her eyes on both sides of a crack that the war had been trying to complete since Guadalcanal. He had promised her once. He had not repeated himself. She was waiting. The 4 rounds in the Garand were not enough. They were going to have to be. He pressed the photograph flat against his chest, 1 second, the way another man might close his eyes and breathe. Then he folded it back, tucked it between the 2nd and 3rd button. He stood up. He had gone backward on the ridge because of the mortar. The mortar position was 60 meters to the rear of the main fighting pits, placed there specifically to cover the forward positions with fire if they were overrun. It was also the only communications relay point on the ridgeline, the place where Morita's radio operator was making the calls that would bring that tube to bear on the fighting pit where the 3 women and the old man were crouching in coral dust. Hayes had not moved backward in panic, but he had moved backward because the fastest way to protect the civilians was to remove the radio before Morita could use it. That was the irrational decision. That was the one that should have killed him 3 different ways. That was the one that, when the pieces clicked into place for the Marines who reconstructed the battle 3 days later, produced a silence in the debriefing room that lasted almost a full minute. He came at the mortar position from its unguarded rear. It had an unguarded rear because nobody put a rear guard on a mortar position 60 meters behind a fortified trench line, because nobody expected 1 American with 4 rifle rounds and a sidearm to be moving toward it from the wrong direction on a ridge that had already been secured. 2 men at the mortar tube. 1 man at the radio man first, and then the mortar crew. And then Hayes was moving forward again, back toward the main position, with a Japanese Type 99 light mortar that he did not have the ammunition to use, but which he carried anyway, because he just thought of something else. What followed was not combat, in the tactical sense. It was the sound of an organized defensive system experiencing the catastrophic stress of an impossible event and beginning to come apart at the seams. The mortar radio was gone. Morita could no longer call for fire support without exposing himself to whatever was destroying his position from the inside. The 2 men he had redirected toward the civilians' position, moving to use them, or move them, or do something that the documents do not fully record, turned a corner in the trench line and found a Marine with a 1911 and a mortar tube, which is such a tactically improbable image that neither of them processed it correctly in time. He moved, fired, dropped, moved again. 30 meters, 20, 10. Marita's voice was no longer clipped and professional. It was sharp, with something that 12 years of Imperial Army service had not trained him to feel. Not fear of dying, which soldiers learned to file away, but fear of something wrong, something that violated the pattern of every assault his position had ever repelled. Men were not reporting in. Positions that should have been active were silent. The American, one American, was somehow moving through his trench network from an interior position that should not have been possible to reach. "How many?" he called again. His radio man was dead. A private named Yoshida, 19 years old, from Kyushu, who had been defending his gun pit with the composure of a soldier 3 times his age, broke and ran, not toward another position, not toward a fallback point, but simply away from the direction of the sounds that were getting closer. 2 other soldiers followed him without being ordered to. They did not know where they were going. They just needed to go somewhere that the sounds were not. Marita knew what this was. He had read about it in training, the hypothetical scenario. A defender whose position has been penetrated at multiple points simultaneously, who cannot establish a perimeter because the threat is inside the perimeter, who has no communications and no fire support. He had read about it. He had never felt it. He understood, in the strange, crystalline clarity that comes to professional soldiers in the moments before the end of a battle, that what had entered his position was not the Marine Corps. It was one man, and that one man had systematically dismantled every tactical advantage a trained defender could hold. He was still trying to form a coherent defense when Hayes came around the final bend in the trench, and they were 6 meters apart. 3 seconds. Then it was over. Marita went down, not dead, but finished. A wound to the shoulder that would eventually take him to a POW camp, and then, years later, to a post-war deposition. The last 2 men in the position dropped their weapons. The fighting pit where the 3 women and the old man had been crouching for the duration of the assault was intact. They were alive, and the white-haired woman was still holding the bundle to her chest. Hayes would learn later it was a Palauan infant, an infant she had taken from a destroyed village 4 days earlier, and refused to surrender regardless of what was happening around her. Hayes stood at the center of Objective Hill 140 and looked at the ridgeline. He had no rounds left in the Garand. The 1911 had 2 rounds remaining. The ridge was his. One shot fired into the air to signal his position to the Marine units below. Then silence. The kind of silence that only exists when something that was very loud has completely stopped. He sat down against the trench wall, pressed his back into the coral, and put both hands flat on his thighs to see if they would stop shaking. They did, eventually. Baker Company's lead element reached the position at 13:12 hours, approximately 90 minutes after the last shot was fired. The Marine sergeant who led the first fire team up the coral draw would later testify in the official after-action report. "We expected to find an abandoned position or a Japanese delaying action. We did not expect to find Corporal Hayes sitting in a Japanese trench with 4 civilian Palauans and approximately 18 enemy KIA distributed across 3 connected fighting positions and a mortar emplacement. The position had been destroyed from the inside. I have been in the Pacific since Guadalcanal, and I do not have words for what I saw on that ridge. The documented count was 19 Japanese soldiers killed, 9 wounded, and 2 captured. One of them, Sergeant Kenji Morita, along with the complete destruction of a mortar position and communications relay. All 4 civilian detainees survived without additional wounds. The interrogations began the following day. Captain Leonard Marsh, the battalion intelligence officer, conducted the initial session with Sergeant Morita through an interpreter. The exchange entered the record and remained classified for over a decade. Marsh asked, "How many Americans attacked this position?" Morita was quiet for a long time. The interpreter noted afterward that he seemed to be deciding whether the honest answer would be believed. Then he said, "1. How many did you say?" "1 man. We had 280 men in prepared positions. Our fields of fire were correct. Our communications were functioning. Everything was in order. 1 American came through the rear of our position from a direction we had designated as impassable. I don't know how many positions he destroyed before I saw him. I know I couldn't count them fast enough to respond." The interpreter wrote in his notes, "He spoke with the flat affect of a man describing something he expects not to be believed, but cannot say differently, because he was there." Among the rank-and-file prisoners captured in the subsequent days of the Umur-Brogol campaign, a specific story was circulating through the Japanese garrison, passed in whispers through the cave network, between men who had been told by survivors of the 62nd Battalion's C Company what had happened on the ridge that morning. They called him Arashi no Hajimari ga Nai, a phrase that translates approximately as the storm that had no beginning. The name came from something specific. Survivors of Morita's position described a feeling, during the assault, of being inside an attack that had no origin point, no direction from which it could be located or measured, no moment they could identify as the entry point where it all began. It simply was, all at once, everywhere, inside their perimeter. In Japanese military culture, a storm that has no beginning is a storm that cannot be defended against, because defense requires knowing where a thing starts. One soldier, a corporal named Hiroshi Tada, gave a post-war deposition to the U.S. Army Historical Division in 1947. He had been in a position 200 meters from the assault, close enough to hear, but not to see. He had heard the sound of the fighting change, from the organized rhythm of a coordinated defense to something he described as the sound of a position learning that it has already lost. He added, "I was afraid, not because I thought I would die, because I could hear men I trusted being afraid." Kenji Morita was not a man who felt fear. The sound of what happened to his position on that day was the sound of something that Morita had no answer for. That was the most frightening thing I have ever heard. The 4 Palawan civilians were evacuated to the rear area medical station. The white-haired woman, through an interpreter, identified herself as Bulek, approximately 67 years old, from a village in the Babel Daob district. She was asked about the American who had been in the position when she was found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in Palawan, that the interpreter rendered as, "He moved through the guns like he had already finished." Corporal Mitchell Arlen Hayes, of Baker Company, 1st Battalion, on 7th Marines was awarded the Medal of Honor. by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on March 12, 1945. At a ceremony at the White House that Hayes attended in his dress uniform with a slight limp he would carry for the rest of his life. The official citation, as entered into the congressional record, reads in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as a rifleman with Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, during operations against the enemy on the island of Palau Islands, on September 26, 1944. After his company was forced to withdraw under heavy enemy fire, and direct orders to disengage were received, Corporal Hayes, cut off from retreat by the intensity of enemy fire, and finding himself alone in an advanced position, chose to continue the assault on a heavily fortified enemy ridgeline held by a numerically superior force. Moving through enemy-held terrain under continuous fire, Corporal Hayes systematically neutralized multiple enemy fighting positions, destroyed an enemy mortar emplacement, eliminated enemy communications capability, and secured the safety of 4 civilian non-combatants who were being held within the objective. His extraordinary valor, tactical resourcefulness, and complete disregard for his own safety in completing an assault mission alone, against all odds and in defiance of every calculation of survivability, reflects the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. Hayes returned to Gallatin, Tennessee, in October of 1945. He did not speak about Palau for 11 years. He married Clara Bowen on December 14, 1945, at the First Methodist Church of Gallatin, 6 blocks from the recruitment office, where he had waited on the steps before it opened in 1941. The photograph, creased, faded, the white lines still running through Clara's face, was framed and hung in the kitchen of their house on Main Street. It hung there for 53 years. In 1956, Hayes gave a single interview to a historian from the University of Tennessee who was compiling a record of Medal of Honor recipients from the state. When asked if he had ever heard about what the Japanese soldiers had called him, Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard something about that, yes." "Does it mean anything to you?" Another pause. "It means they were paying attention." The capture of Objective Hill 140 on September 26th, 1944, opened a breach in the 62nd Battalion's defensive line that Marine commanders leveraged in the following 2 days to collapse the northern section of the Umur-Bro-Gal pocket, significantly accelerating the end of organized resistance on Palau, and sparing what subsequent analysis estimated to be 80 to 120 American casualties that would have been incurred against the intact position. 1 man, 1 ridge. A number of lives he never knew he saved, going home to people who never knew his name. Sit with that for a moment. He was given intelligence that was wrong, 3 times wrong, wrong about the numbers, wrong about the route, wrong about the position's reinforcement. He was given orders that changed at the worst possible moment. He walked into an ambush that was specifically designed for exactly where he was, and he found civilians inside an objective he was supposed to neutralize. Every single thing that could go wrong did go wrong, and the men who tried hardest to stop him, professional soldiers, battle-hardened veterans with fortified positions, superior numbers, and tactical advantages that, should have made the outcome a formality. Those men gave him a name when it was over. Not because they had to, because when you have no other word for something, you create one. The storm that had no beginning. If you have ever worn a uniform, if you have ever been in a position where the plan was gone and the support was gone, and the radio was telling you to do something that could not be done, but the mission was still there, and the people who needed you were still there, you know this weight. Not the weight of courage. The weight of the thing that remains after courage has been used up, and what's left is just a man pressing his hands flat against the earth to make them stop shaking, and then standing up anyway. You know that weight. For everyone else, Mitchell Hayes was not an extraordinary man who did ordinary things well. He was an ordinary man who was placed into a situation that had no margin for failure, and who found, in that margin, exactly what he had promised, someone he would find. He had promised Clara once. He did not repeat himself. He came home. He married her. The photograph, creased and faded, the line still running through her face, hung in their kitchen for 53 years, until Clara passed in 1998 and Mitch moved to a smaller house. His son found it in a box while clearing the old place. It was still folded in the same four-fold pattern, between the second and third button. The crease had never been repaired. Some things you carry exactly as they are, because to restore them would be to pretend that what they went through didn't happen. And what they went through was the reason you came back. Mitch Hayes died on April 3rd, 2001, in Gallatin, Tennessee. He was 80 years old. He finished what he started. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. Who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments.